We're not going to start for another 2 or 3 minutes, but we might as well do self-introductions. And why don't we start over here on my left?
I'm Barbara Wilson. I live in Beaverton.
Dayton Wilson, Beaverton.
Jim Kane, Cedarville.
Introduce ourselves. Dan. I live in Beaverton,
Kimball Sheriff's Office. Marie Tyler, Sheriff's Office.
Kathy Stenson, Incorporated Beaverton.
Al Falcone, Aloha.
Bob Herman, District Attorney's Office.
Jeff Warren, Sheriff's Office.
Phil Nelson, Bethany.
Gary Olson, Garden Home.
John Williams, Cedar Hills.
Chris Leslie, Rock Creek. Innebug, Elk Hill.
Esther Calvin, Incorporated Beaverton.
Ron Vanel, Cedarville.
Sally Vanel, Cedarville.
Sheriff Pat Garrett, Washington County.
Eric Squires, the sovereign empire of Aloha.
Aren't you the mayor of Aloha?
Sure.
Sigu Nander Cornelius.
Well, folks, the TV's not on yet, but
It is.
it is. Well, this is the Washington County Public Affairs Forum. That's a public service of the public affairs members who try to bring issues of general interest to the public to the notice of the public. And I think we have determined what the public isn't interested in, sort of by omission. But in any event, a very serious topic is crime and corrections and the expenditures thereof. And the two gentlemen that we've invited to speak to the forum are on a commission that's studying some of those things. One of the most comprehensive, I think, views of the subject since the Sentencing Guidelines Commission. And the first person who's going to speak is John Foote, a Clackamas County District Attorney. I've actually known John for time and many incarnations. And he's actually married to Circuit Court Judge Suzanne Upton, who sits on the Washington County bench. Larry Matasar is going to be speaking. He's on the commission. He's a long-term defense lawyer, and he's going to be giving, I assume, an alternate or presentation to Mr. Foote's. But I think that most people here are in some way associated with either as lawyers or in the system. So without further ado, I will ask John Foote. And Mr. Foote will be speaking for about 10 minutes. I think he has some packets that I'll pass out for him. So, John, if you'd like to come on up, I can hand those out for you if you'd like.
Oh, they're going to be back there.
Good afternoon. As John said, my name is John Foote, and I have the privilege of serving as the DA in Clackamas County. And I know I'm poaching on Bob Herman's territory, so I'm glad he's here today to make sure I don't mess up. Larry and I kind of agreed that we would each kind of make a 10-minute or so statement, and then we both stand up here and kind of throw it open. And Larry's somebody I've known for a long time and I respect, but we do see things very differently. So I think it's good to hear both points of view. One of the advantages I think I have is that I've worked as a defense attorney, and I've worked in the Department of Corrections for 5 years in leadership, and then as a line prosecutor, and now my current job. So I understand it's a system, and whatever one of us does, that lump in the snake moves all the way down. So what the sheriff's office is busy in, and what we do, and the courts, and everybody else. So we think in those terms. Let me start out by telling you the good news. And in public safety, there's a lot of it. You wouldn't know it, but there really is. Now, I'm not saying any crime is an acceptable amount, because it never is, but we live at a very unusual time. Crime rates are at a 40-year low. Violent crime is down 50% since 1995 when Measure 11 passed. It's the second biggest drop in violent crime in the country. So that's a great thing. What's also great is that we've done it in such a smart way. Let me give you some examples. We've prioritized violent crime. Oregon leads the country in the percentage, and this is a little, hope I get this right so you understand, the percentage of inmates in prison for violent crime. We have the highest percentage of any state in the country, 70%. So we prioritized. We rank in the bottom third of the states in our incarceration rate. That is the number of prison beds for every 1,000 citizens. We lead the country in the lowest percentage of inmates, this is the inverse of violent, in for nonviolent crime, drugs and property crimes. We have instituted truth in sentencing in Oregon. In other words, basically the sentence that is ordered is the one served, with a little bit of flexibility. We changed that first in 1990. We have done a wonderful job of increasing the importance of the voice of victims in a series of things, many of them voter initiatives, culminating now where victims have enforceable rights. That means if their rights are not honored, they don't get to say what happens in a case. We have a little different system than that. But they do have a right to be heard and participate. And if they don't, if we and DAs have the responsibility to make sure that happens, they can go to court and get a case brought back, which, believe me, in the eyes of people in our work is a really important thing and makes us really be on our toes. So, and finally, a couple other statistics. 75% of convicted felons in Oregon don't go to prison. I think it's actually higher than that, but that's the official number we have. And if you add misdemeanors, people who commit misdemeanors, and we have many more of those than felonies, over 90% of all the criminal cases that people like Bob and I see, our offices see, are people who do not go to prison when they're convicted. So we prioritize. You may think that more ought to go, but at least we're targeting the right people. And it's been effective. And finally, Oregon has instituted a requirement that when we put programs together for people who have been convicted of a crime, that those programs be based on evidence-based practices. In other words, there be some scientific or study that shows it makes a difference. I think we have some more work to do on that. But that's the principle, and that's a good thing. So why is the commission happening? Well, this is our third version. We had the Reset Committee 3 years ago by Governor Kulongowski. It's on a shelf in my office. I think I brought it here, actually, if you want to see it. And it didn't go anywhere. And then we had the first Governor's Commission on Public Safety last year that didn't go anywhere. And now we have this one. And there are 11 of us on it. I'm the only DA. There's a sheriff. Sheriff Myers from Marion County. Larry's on it. A judge is on it. It's a much better cross-section. But what are we trying to fix? There are some people on the commission who want to change sentencing. They think that's the way, what we need to do. We need to shorten sentences. I think that's a mistake. But that's what they think. And what the governor has said is that we're going to have too many people in prison, it's going to cost too much money. So it's a money problem. And every sheriff and every DA understand about money problems because we have to put budgets together ourselves. So let me give you a couple of pieces of information about how I see the money problem, put it in perspective, and then the DAs have a list of proposals to attack it that do not necessarily go where the commission may go, but we think they're a balanced approach. Number one, public safety is 17% of the state budget. And public safety includes criminal defense, defense attorneys, indigent defense, about $220 million. It includes the courts, it includes the state police, and it includes community corrections, which is community supervision, and includes prisons. Prisons themselves are 9% of the state budget. So the first thing I think is important to know is that we're not going to fix the state budget by whacking away at prisons. This is not going to happen. There's not enough money there. So, but what can we do? There's a prison forecast. Have you all heard of this? The state tries to forecast a number of things. They forecast revenue. The budget forecast comes out. We just had one. They build their budgets off of it, what the economists say the budget's going to, what the revenue's going to be and whatever. And they do that twice a year. They also have a prison forecast twice a year. And there's a forecast committee, and they're very talented forecasters who work for the state who put out a forecast. They've been doing it for a number of years. And that forecast currently says we're going to have over 2,000 more inmates in 10 years. And what are we going to do about it? The governor has said we're going to have to build prisons if that happens. And he's put a price tag of $600 million. I think that's off. And I have some reasons for saying that. Number one, if you look at the history of forecasting in Oregon and prisons, and I have sheets back there for you on the table if you want to see them, the forecast has been off on an average of 7%. What's interesting is that it's never been low, the 10-year forecast. Financial forecasting, sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low. You know, sometimes they'll forecast this much money and then we'll hear that they're 300 million short. That never happens in 10-year prison forecasts. It's always high. So there are theories about that, but if we apply that to the numbers that we're looking at, it cuts it by about in half, if that's right. But we don't know. The second thing is, this 2,000 inmate growth, 62% of it is going to be the result of Oregon's population growing, not sentencing policy, just the state getting bigger, which carries a tax base. There's a chart back there that shows you the projected growth in revenue for the state and the projected growth in prisons for the state over the next 10 years. Revenue 49%, prison growth 16%. So we think there's money that would be money, and there are over 2,000 empty prison beds in our current system right now. So that's just stuff to think about. So here's what the package the DA's put together, more or less. Number one, some targeted sentence reductions in two areas. Number one, changing the amount of marijuana that a defendant has to possess who's selling. We don't send people to prison for possession, but who's selling up to the level that the federal government uses in federal court, which would save, they said, about 120 beds. And then changing the law on driving while suspended. There is a provision of the law now that a certain kind of driving while suspended crimes can go to prison. It's a felony and they can go to prison. We said, make felony driving while suspended so it's not a prison sentence anymore. Still can go to local jail. That saves about 60 beds, I said. So that's about 180. When you take those off, we're talking about 600 beds. And if you look at the forecast every month, it's sort of like your bank account. If the intakes are greater than the releases in prison, your population goes up. The way you stabilize it is to make intakes and releases balance, right? Like anything else. On average, over the next 3 years, to do that, we'd have to reduce the number of people going to prison by 31 a month statewide. It's not an undoable number. And over the 10 years, it drops down to about 18 a month that we have to reduce the people going in versus coming out. We think there's a way to do it. We target the group of people that are being revoked off of supervision, probation, parole, and post-prison. It's about 2,200 people a year. And we make some investments in these evidence-based programs, a few of them that we believe can make a difference. There's some studies that show they work. One is reentry, and the other is something called hope probation. There might be others. And we target those groups, and we attack that difference. And if we do that, the population will stabilize. We also think that we have to do something about our corrections per inmate per day costs. We are one of the highest in the country. And we are one of the lower incarceration rates, and we don't think we should be spending our time with this. We spend more time with this and reinvest that money in these other programs. That's it in a nutshell, because we're trying to help, despite the ideological differences. And my time is up, and it's Larry's turn. Thank you.
I'm Larry Matasar. I'm a lawyer in private practice. I generally do criminal defense cases, but I also often represent both lawyers and doctors in professional misconduct allegations. I want to say a few words about the forecasts and some of the other purposes of the commission. First of all, while there's some dispute about the forecasts in the past, I think the forecasters are very well aware of that, and I don't think anybody disagrees with the idea that just in the next 2 years, there's going to be a demand for maybe 800 to 1,000 more beds in the prisons, in Oregon's prisons. And I think it's clear, as John indicated, that Oregon does have a relatively low incarceration rate and focuses more than most states on incarcerating the most violent prisoners. But since 2000, the state's incarceration rate has grown more than 3 times faster than the national rate. And the increase here is one of the things that the projected near-term increase, especially of nonviolent offenders, is what it appears to me drove the governor to create the commission. And there's also an important point, which if you look at the other states you will see, is that there is no necessary relationship between higher incarceration rate and low crime. Several states, which the commission is studying, have shown that the incarceration rate can go down and crime can go down. The traditional idea that the only way to get the crime level down is by increasing incarceration is not statistically accurate, especially in the recent past, meaning 10, 20 years. For example, the overwhelming decrease in crime in New York State has been accompanied by a decrease in the incarceration rate. John talked briefly about the people who make these forecasts. It's important to recall, to know that the committee is chaired by a circuit court judge. It includes the director of the Department of Prisons, Department of Corrections, I should say. It includes a DA, a sheriff, and community corrections and parole people. So it is a group of people very well versed in the how the system works. I just wanted to point out the 4 important aspects that the governor cited when he created the commission. And by the way, there are 2 versions of the most recent commission. There was the version that didn't have John or I on it, which started last year, and then it was expanded to include several more people, including a prosecutor and defense lawyer. But what the governor said is that in addressing public safety policy, the commission must focus on 4 core outcomes: the safety of our citizens in their homes and communities, accountability for criminal offenses, an efficient system that controls costs, and 4, a system that is smart and fair. And the governor re-emphasized these points when he came to a commission meeting a few months ago. It's important, and he said something similar to what he said in his creation statement, which is that any concepts developed by the commission must put the safety of our citizens as the top priority. And so there's no sense amongst the people on the commission that we're not concerned about the safety of the community. That's the main thing, that by the treatment and the earn time and the other factors that the commission is strongly considering, we will get to a safer place. A few words about the members of the commission. Besides the august members such as John and myself, it includes Andy Olson, who's the head of the Republicans in the House in Salem. He was a state police officer for 29 years. It includes Republican Senator Jackie Winters from Salem. It includes guy Chris Garrett, a Democratic representative who is a lawyer at a big Portland law firm. It includes Dick Withnell, a Salem car dealer, who was very active in some of the Kevin Mannix-led ballot measures. And it includes several law enforcement people besides John. There's Jason Myers, the Marion County Sheriff, who said at the very last commission meeting, when there was some discussion about Measure 11, he said he viewed Measure 11 as a high-performance automobile which has a whole lot of complicated moving parts, and he doesn't think that it would be wise to mess with it. So again, it's important for you to be aware that the commission consists of many people, mostly appear to be strongly in favor of tough law enforcement. And I think what the commission is trying to do is to look at social scientific data. It's not just these kinds of government commissions. The courts, Chief Justice or former Chief Justice Demunis just issued a 80-page opinion on eyewitness testimony, which is reliant on social scientific information. This is what moves the legislature and others to decide the best way to do things. And some of the factors that the commission is concerned about or has suggested are earned time credits, which essentially would mean that defendants sentenced to prison could earn reduced sentences by programs and other kinds of good behavior. It is shown that that kind of incentive will both be a very effective management tool in the prisons and also lead to reduced recidivism, which is, after all, the main goal. Because remember, people get out, whether they're in prison for 75 months or 30 months or 80 months, the vast, vast majority of people get out. And one of the goals is to make sure when they get out that they don't commit another crime. I think it's fair to say, at least from the meetings, that the goal of reducing recidivism is the main point of most of these changes. Along with the earned time credits, there's reentry services to get people, when they're getting out, more integrated into the community. There are also victim services, which will be a part of the package, it appears. Special courts, whether they be drug courts or other kinds of courts which are aimed at specific kinds of offenders and specific crimes. And the last thing I want to say here before we open it for questions is the broad base of the support across the country for just this kind of effort. I read an editorial recently that was sent to me from the Bend Bulletin, which talked about, let me read some of it. It says, "We must be tough on criminal justice spending, backing cost-effective approaches that hold offenders accountable. In the last decade, Oregon's commitment to the sensible approach, which we all are aware of incarcerating the most serious people, has wavered. A growing number of expensive prison beds are occupied by nonviolent offenders, while spending on local public safety has been cut. The main question is, will taxpayers get the best result for the lowest cost?" And the editorial, or the op-ed piece, talks about Texas, where one state where policymakers have found that they can protect and even improve public safety while reducing incarceration. Like Oregon, Texas was facing the prospect of adding thousands of beds and enacted reforms similar to what we have. And the odd thing about this piece, to me, was that it was written by Grover Norquist, one of the leading conservatives in the United States, who talked about how he has joined Newt Gingrich, Ed Meese, Bill Bennett, and others in supporting an initiative called Right on Crime, which brings together conservative leaders who are eager to see our criminal justice system work better. And this editorial concluded with a specific endorsement, oddly, stating, "Oregon's Commission on Public Safety is now engaged in a critical effort to get the state back on track by developing proposals that would hold offenders accountable, keep government spending in check, and most importantly, keep communities safe." I can't really say that Grover Norquist is a person who I generally go to support the principles that I am espousing, But I think in this case, he shows the broad-based coalition for using social science and using modern information to both reduce spending and make our community safer. So I'll save John the 30-second orange thing, and I'm sure I'll save John Tyner, who was about to show it to me, and John and I are pleased to answer any questions. I should say I've known John for a long time, and while we do disagree, as I think you will see if you haven't already, we have one of the better things about our profession is that we can have people that we profoundly disagree with and have, most of the time, a civil discussion about important issues. So, we can take
Any questions?
What percentage of the people in the prison have mental health problems, and what is the state doing to address those?
What I will say is, may apply to other questions. My role in the system as a criminal defense lawyer is to represent individuals accused in individual cases. While I have studied and studied and studied as much as I can about the broad issues that the commission is concerned with, I do not have, even less so than Mr. Foote here, an understanding of the statistical information that would be necessary and that to answer your question would be required to answer your question. I can say that in my practice, which has been long, I've been defending criminal cases for quite some time. I've been a lawyer since 1974 and essentially dealing with prisoners and criminal defense since 1976. The proportion is large of people who commit crimes and who are incarcerated with mental health problems, and the amount of treatment that they get is not enough as it should be. Beyond that, I can't say much.
Perhaps I could put that in a little bit different context, and let me try. Before I do that, I love it when Larry quotes Grover Norquist, because I know he breaks out in a rash when he does it. Yeah, right. And what I encourage you to do, I wrote an editorial response to Mr. Norquist's editorial in the Bend Bulletin, because I just think Pew's in the wrong state. And what they tout Texas, but they're fourth in the United States in incarceration rate after all the reforms. We're 33rd. Their crime rate's twice ours. So, and New York's got a whole different story by itself too. They used to lock up people who possess drugs. Remember there were those laws from a governor who passed in Pataki about possession of drugs. We don't do that in Oregon. So we're way ahead. They're just in the wrong state. But going back to your question, the way this worked out with individual people is that somebody's, and Larry can correct me on this if he thinks I get it wrong, but when we get somebody who's charged with a crime, their mental health at some point gets in the discussion, unless it's a very minor crime. And we have done, so the first question in our forum is the mental illness, if there is one, or if there's evidence of one, does it constitute a defense to the crime? In other words, they could not conform their conduct, and they don't know right from wrong. There's a legal test. And that's the first question. Because if that's no, if they are legally responsible while they have a mental illness, punishment comes first. And that happens in every case. Some are more litigated than others. And we have tried to do a lot to divert people on less serious crimes. We have a mental health court in our county, which I helped get started, to try and divert repeat low-level offenders with a much more intensive program to get them housing, get them on their meds, and if possible, a job, so they don't get, you know the patterns. So we're trying to do a lot, but what's fundamentally happened is that the courts ordered our hospitals, our mental hospitals, emptied 25 years ago, and just tightened the ability to hold people in a mental hospital. And so they're on the street. And, while you may like or not like that, that's kind of changed the conversation. And Local jails, the sheriff knows this, that's where it lands first. And most often, because people in crisis end up in the local jail, it takes a while to go to prison. So, because you got to be prosecuted first. So you end up sitting in the local jail. Usually people get better when they're held because we get them on their meds and they're sleeping and they're, you know, they're stabilizing. But we divert most of them. I can't think of a serious criminal that our office has prosecuted in the last 10 years who didn't have mental illness problems. Some of the stuff we see in vernacular is crazy, but it doesn't mean they're mentally ill, and protection and punishment, proportional punishment is one of the priorities. So it's a complicated answer. I think we're doing much better at it, but when we talk about high cost per day per inmate for the Oregon prison system, it's about $80-some a day. The more resources we put in there, the more expensive it gets. So it's a challenge how to balance all this. Hope that helps.
Let me add that I agree with what John says, and that I think I see a concern on the individual case basis for the individual defendant, both from the prosecutor's office and then later on from the court. As far as the treatment, this is a complicated problem.
My name is Bill Kroger. I'm a forum member. Thanks for coming in and talking today. My question is related to what you were talking about. It involves drugs and alcohol. And I've heard over the years, I've heard that, you know, half or more of the people who are incarcerated are in there because of drug and alcohol related crimes. I'm wondering if that's true and maybe what's kind of being done about that. And you look up in Washington State with the new law on marijuana and stuff, and I'm wondering if that's going to change this whole thing around a little bit.
Good question, and it's like everything else, it's a little bit of a nuanced answer. I don't think most people are in prison because drugs or alcohol made them do it. If you know the kind of typical antisocial behavior that involves chronic criminals, they sleep during the day and they're up at night and they're out. They live a very different life than a person who's in society. That's kind of what antisocial means. And being intoxicated or high is part of that environment. So yes, there is a great association with it, but I don't think they cause the behavior. I think they're part of the behavior, and the Hope Court is designed to sort of try and help people break free out of it. And I could go into that, and I won't, but it's real interesting. In terms of what's going on in Washington State, all the studies I've seen show that when you legalize marijuana, you're going to get more of it. That's really the bottom line. And for me, before all this started, it wasn't a crime to possess less than an ounce. We weren't exactly draconian here. You get a ticket and maybe pay a fine, and we didn't go run around chasing people for that. So, do I think it's good we have another intoxicant in our culture? No, I don't. Do I think it's the end of the world? No, I think we're getting there by inches anyway. But you know what I mean? I mean, it's not, I don't want to demonize people who want to legalize marijuana, but I just don't think it's very healthy or a good idea. And I think it's going to be real interesting to see what happens in Washington State if in fact that's what happens and people move there because they want to smoke dope. But there are a lot of people who spend all their time thinking about marijuana for some reason, which to me seems like a really bad use of your time. So anyway.
I wanted to agree, as I often do with Mr. Foote. One, there are people that you see that are so addicted to drugs that they can't even say they're going to stop. I've had cases where people have refused probation because they have to pee in a bottle every 30 days, and they just did not want to give it up. And I also want to agree with John, and this is how I put it to my children over the years. If you're drinking and out at 2 o'clock in the morning, there's a good chance something bad's going to happen. You know, and a lot of, I don't know about the lifestyle of the people who commit crimes. I've not seen studies, but a lot of our athletes will say that you see when they're in trouble. I mean, there's just a lot of problems. And if you add going to a strip club on top of that at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're probably over 50% likely to have some sort of problem.
Maybe not than that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Kathy Stanton, forum member. Thank you for coming. I've got 5 questions. I'm going to do one because that's all I'm allowed to do, which is just fine. But I'm going to rephrase Mr. Kroger's question because I didn't hear the answer to the question that actually I want to have answered. Sometime in the last couple, well, it's number one, I did not vote yes on Measure 11, I voted no. And whatever the last reiteration was on the property crimes, I voted no. But my concern is for those people who are incarcerated, not getting an attorney, not going before the system. I'm talking about those who have become incarcerated for one reason or another. There is a much higher percentage of the prison population with mental illness and drug and alcohol issues than the general population. And I thought that some money, for whatever reason, whether it was a ballot measure or just in the budget, and the programs were being designated in the state to provide treatment for incarcerated prisoners. And that's what I would like you gentlemen to address, since you are looking at the whole system, and I'm assuming it's not just the prosecutorial side. Can you tell us about what the state is doing in the state facilities to address the drug and alcohol addiction and mental illness issues of prisoners who, according to what you're saying, are going to be coming out into the general population again? Thank you.
I'm afraid I'm going to get the answer wrong because you noticed I didn't answer it last time, so forgive me. Let me give you a start. I don't really know what they're doing in corrections anymore because I'm not there. So I hear things. But let me start with something I do know, which is you were referring to money for treatment and remembering something about it. Let me tell you what I think you're remembering, and I might be wrong. Back in 2008, when we voted on the property crime measures, if you remember, Kevin Mannix had a Measure 61, which would have created mandatory minimum sentences for repeat property criminals. And myself, I was coming in as president of the ODAA, I didn't like the law. You'd be surprised to learn that there isn't a DA in this state who's ever publicly endorsed or helped write a law creating mandatory minimums. Just so you know that. We think Measure 11 has turned out to be pretty darn effective, but we didn't write it and we didn't campaign for it. So when Measure 61 came along, I didn't like it for a lot of different reasons. So I started talking to my colleagues and then to the legislature about an alternative measure to compete with it. And my first thought was to do something that would satisfy Kevin Mannix and he would pull his ballot measure, 61, and we wouldn't have a fight. And I won't bore you with all the details, but when I got entangled in that, I found out why things break in Salem, because I couldn't get either side to stop fighting with each other. We came very close, but we couldn't do it. And we designed a ballot measure that provided for enhanced sentences for repeat property offenders without mandatory minimums, with judicial discretion. But we strengthened the current law, which was you had to commit 5 felonies before you were eligible for a prison sentence. Even eligible. And we tightened it. And I think we can go into the details if you'd like. And I went out and campaigned for it. I debated Kevin Mannix in front of the city club. In Clackamas County, they both passed. But our measure came in first. Statewide, our measure was 57, and his measure was 61. Our measure got 60%, his measure got 49.7%. So our measure became the law. Our measure, part of the deal we all put together to get it on the ballot was money for treatment. I think it was $40 million originally. It's progressively shrunk. So it was a package deal to sort of target the problem. And the year after it passed, the legislature suspended it, which made me wonder why I bothered. And we were kind of back in the same situation again. This is one of the challenges of being in Salem, is that you think you're helping, and then suddenly you find out you got snookered. Yeah. So, and that's one of the things I'm struggling with on the commission now is what are the promises being made to us now? And I'm talking to my colleagues and the sheriffs and the chiefs about that. Not because I think ill will of people. I know everyone's trying to do what they believe is right, but here's the other thing that really, when you're been in 32 years, Larry's been in from his perspective, he's got his own frustrations, but what frustrates someone like me is when you see us wanting to go back to something that was broken. And this idea of just kind of revamping sentencing back towards the 80s with lots of back-end releases, and it just, when we've come so far and done so well, this is the most successful part of state government. I told the governor this, there isn't any part of government that can claim the successes of public safety in the last 25 years, with very targeted things. So that kind of lights up your fuse a little bit, because like in life, you hate it when you repeat the same mistake, you rather than be new ones. And I feel like we're going to want to go back and forget the things that didn't work before and go back and start using them again. While I say that, I understand everybody's got a different barometer about when somebody should go to prison. But I would suggest that if you go on our office website and I put all the stuff in it, not only the stuff that's here today I brought for you, but other letters I've written on the commission, because I'm a minority, I'm in the minority position on them. I think I'm a very reasonable person, but I'm in the minority. And at one point, the Pew Foundation told us that 26% of convicted felons last year in Oregon went to prison in 2011. We're low risk. Now, as an office that sees those people, I thought, that doesn't sound right to me. Can I see the list? I'd like to see who they are. And it took a little bit of time, about 3 weeks, but I got it. And statewide, it was 857 people. And of course, I didn't really know the names. And so I organized it by county, and I sent it out to every DA and said, who are these people? And we were all in for a shock as to who these people were. And if you want to see it for yourself, if you go on our website and look for the one that says low-risk offenders, the list is on there. I gave one to every legislator in my county because I said, you know, the inference from that was we're locking a lot of people up who don't need to be there. And maybe you might think there are people on there who don't need to be there. But you can see for yourself the criminal histories and the crimes they committed. And that's how we ended up with the recommendation about marijuana and driving while suspended, because I had my prosecutors look at it and say, is there anybody in there we could handle outside of prison? And they came up with those suggestions. So, but if you want to see who we're sending, not the kind of talk, but go look. And you may find people on there you don't think belong there. But I think you probably find that people have worked their way there in Oregon, either by committing a very bad crime or by committing a lot of crime. And, you know, it's a hard thing to think about. And we don't want to, you know, nobody wants to lock anybody else up personally. But if we don't do it a reasonable way, we can't protect ourselves, and we can't hold people accountable. So that's just me talking. That's not the commission, and that's certainly not Larry. And I think on individual cases, Larry and I aren't as far apart as we might end up being on this. And I feel as the only DA, I'm kind of there for the other DAs, so. Talk too much, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, that's good. From my perspective, as opposed to the commission's perspective, it seems to me that the sentences are far too long, that there's no reason, there's no additional deterrence gained with the sentences that we have, and for many of the most serious crimes, which are not on the table in this commission. There's no, the governor's made clear, there's been no effort by the commission to deal with any of the serious Measure 11 offenses. There has been some discussion about 3 of the least serious Measure 11 offenses, which are, of course, serious crimes, but they have already been changed in some way by the legislature. So, as far as treatment goes, which was the question, I think one of the focuses of the commission is to encourage treatment. As I said before, and again, I had expected when I started this work that this would be all about dividing up a pie, that there's only so much money and we're going to divide up the pie. So I was ready for discussions like, I believe, for example, that if you have the choice of giving somebody a 24-month sentence, say a drug offender, you can give them a 24-month sentence and then say adios at the end of it, or you could spend that money with a 12-month sentence, and which is a long time to go to prison, really, would seem to me. Having never been there, I wouldn't want to go for 12 months. 12 months and then spend the money with treatment and education and follow-up to assure that they're no longer going to be using drugs when they get out. That seems like a more sensible and cheaper approach. So I'm saying that with the understanding that I know John Foote is not against treatment for drug users. I'm sure he is.
Can I just say one thing about that? The Hope Probation is a real interesting program. It's in Hawaii. We've got a pilot program in Clackamas County. And in essence, the judge created it there because he got so frustrated with traditional probation. And he said, okay, here's the way it's going to work. The people on this program, you're going to be drug tested every week. You come in. If you don't show up, we'll go get you. And you go to jail. If you fail, you're going to jail. But the jail pops will be a couple of days. If you lie or run, it gets longer, maybe 10 days. And the idea was swift and immediate with really rigorous drug testing. If you drug tested positive for a number of months every week, and sometimes twice a week, you might be moved back to every other week for a while, and then more. And then if you tested positive, you start back at the beginning. And then they did a very rigorous randomly controlled trial test of this in Hawaii. And the judge said originally, the reason I did this was because I don't raise my children the way we run probation. I don't wait till they screwed up a lot and then throw them to prison. I punish them the first time, proportionally. So he changed it to work like that. Here's what they found. 51% of the people on the probation, on Hope Probation, never tested positive. These are people with a history of drug usage. They stopped. 40% of them, the next 40%, tested positive up to 3 times and then stopped. 90% of the people in Hope Probation stopped using drugs, and we know it because we're not taking their word, they're being tested without any treatment. And so the evaluator said that she came to believe there's a difference between people who have a habit of using drugs and people who have a drug habit. And that we spend too much money on this group, and we don't have to spend treatment money on them. They will stop if it's worth it to them. The worst thing they don't like is a jail sentence right when they aren't ready for it. Doesn't matter how long it is. So they just stop. It's been remarkably successful. And what you have then is kind of the judge talks about a triage. You can take the scarce treatment resources you have for the people who really can't stop. And then you use a variety of things like you would an emergency room and an intensive care, and drug court would be the intensive care. So it's really interesting. I thought it was so interesting we applied for this grant. We got a pilot going. We're going to be evaluated too. So it isn't always about treatment. It's about the right leverage, I think. And being a lot smarter and targeted about how we do this. With the vast majority of people we don't send to prison. And he did it without any resources. So.
Agreed. Good idea. Peter Buck, forum member. I'd like to bring you back to the announced topic of this talk. Can Oregon afford its present correction system? You seem to agree on most things. If you agree on this, is there anything that you actually disagree on?
Well, I think the biggest thing we disagree on is the length of sentences in Oregon. I would say the data that we have seen shows that this 2,300 bed increase over the next 10 years will cost Oregon hundreds of millions of dollars, which I think is a waste of money. So I think that's as direct as I could be about whether we can afford it. I suppose we could find the money from somewhere, but in my view, it would be an unwise expenditure of Oregonians' money.
I think I would say that what we can afford is a much bigger question than just public safety, because it's such a small part of the state budget. And it's in that larger conversation, I think, that all of this has to happen. And I think we have to do something about cost per day. They're too high. I don't know what the answer is. I think corrections has to do that. And I think we need to stay on the path we're on, which is we are reducing crime in a very smart way. I have to disagree with Larry about the fact that incarceration doesn't reduce crime. There's an institute in Washington State, I think it's called the Institute on Public Policy, and it's a think tank, if I got the name right, that studies public policy, and it does lots of costs evaluation and benefits. It's much more kind of a scientific approach. And they conclusively believe that the higher the incarceration rate, the lower the crime. In other words, the fewer victims. The question is, when have you struck the right balance? Now, the question really is, are we willing to lower it and suffer the consequences? I hate to think that way, because that's not fair to anybody. But I think we have to understand that there is a relationship, at least according to this institute, and it's not a public safety institute. So I do think that's true. So
Let me say that there's a book that I read after I was appointed to the commission by a former, now deceased Harvard Law professor named Stuntz, S-T-U-N-T-Z, a brilliant book which he is titled something like The Collapse of Criminal Justice, something like that. It's by a very conservative writer, a man who, for goodness sakes, from my perspective, disagrees with many of the protections in the Bill of Rights, many of the procedural due process protections. Nonetheless, he has the only word is brilliant view of, historical view of crime and punishment in the United States over the last many years. I can't speak highly enough about a book that I suggest people who are interested in this general topic should read carefully.
Hello, Bruce Bartlett, foreign member. I really appreciate this conversation. I've served on the county's Behavioral Health Council since 1993, and at that time, Washington County's Community Corrections was leading pretty much the state and the nation in using evidence-based practices under the direction of John Hartner. And Michael Finnegan did a study finding that $1 spent on treatment over the course of the criminal would save about $6 in total society spending on them. California did a similar study and found that it was a 10-to-1 return. Spending $1 on treatment yields savings. And one of the interesting things about their analysis, John did this with Ginger Martin, was that if you treat a low-risk offender like a high-risk offender, you're likely to drive them into being more of a criminal. So I'm really heartened to hear you talking about engaging the individuals at the level that most profoundly influences them. And I personally am a big fan of using community corrections more and the prison system less because of the hands-on approach, I've toured Washington County's community corrections and found people who aren't in the system still going back there for the support that they got from the programs that were run. And so I'm very heartened by this. End of my soapbox. The question I have is sort of a modest proposal. And since the criminal justice system is based on fines and sentences, a $500 fine to somebody working at a job basically has no impact, where if you take an unemployed person who is on the lower socioeconomic rungs of the ladder, $500 is like huge. And so, for example, I could peel off $100 bills until the problem goes away for most of the things that I might do. Well, I mean, I'm not bragging, and please, don't take this seriously. But to a person who doesn't have any resources, that same challenge is hideously complicating. And so I wonder, would means-based testing for fines be, what do you think of that? So somebody that could afford $5,000 and feel pain might be assessed that fine, whereas somebody unemployed, $50 would inflict the same amount of pain on them.
Let me say, answer both of your comments. First of all, as far as the community corrections idea, I think there have been several proposals as part of the commission which I think are going to be pushed forward to the legislature and the governor that would fund local and community corrections ideas more. So I think that the understanding is that that's a good idea. As far as fines, it's simply not generally a part of criminal justice in Oregon. The fine is, from what I have seen, the idea of using fine as a punishment is, while they exist and costs are generally imposed, neither in the state court nor in the federal court in Oregon are fines a financial punishment thoughtfully used. I'm not saying that that's a good idea or a bad idea, but there's been very little focus on the importance of using financial penalties.
It becomes an exquisite torture of poor people and simply an annoyance for them.
Of course, the cost. I can't tell you how many times, especially when I was a public defender, which was forever ago, you impose $20 a month, $50 a month, $30 a month, whatever. Those amounts for some people is nothing. For the cases that I have now where people pay me to be their lawyer, the financial penalty is generally nothing. And yes, they are meaningful, even the court costs.
I think the idea behind those is that the people who are causing the problem help pay for it. But I understand the judges, we don't do debtors' prisons in Oregon, so you can't lock somebody up who can't afford to pay. That went away many years ago. So if somebody fails to pay and they don't have the money, they can't be locked up. But the idea is that the people who are causing the need for probation or supervision are having to pay for it. And that was, I think, the theory behind it. But it's a case-by-case conversation between the defendant and generally the court. We're there usually, but it's really not we're just supporting whatever the court wants to do usually.
And then you have the parents or the friend. Let's say something is imposed. You did something wrong. I'm going to make you pay $500. Well, then maybe father, mother, brother, or sister pays the money, and then it doesn't really have an impact.
Funny story. A defense attorney that Larry knows that I won't say what it is. He used to charge very high fees for his costs. He was a good lawyer. And somebody asked him once, so, what do people do? He said, what do you tell them? And he said, well, I tell them if I win, I'm worth it. And if I lose, you aren't going to need it. Kind of cold.
I have lots of good VA stories too, but I'll spare you.
Good afternoon, Marie Tyler, the jail commander here in Washington County. I have a kind of twofold question, and just as a little tiny piece of background. Years ago, we came to this forum and talked a little bit about the programs in our jail, and programs and treatment seem to be of interest today. So I want to talk about one of the things that we do and see how this would equate maybe at a state level. So one of the things I heard you mention as a recommendation was changing the earned time credit. And I didn't hear you say from what to what, but I'm assuming that that the recommendation is to expand that to larger. In our jail, when we assess people for programs, and I concur with much of what's been said about, defining who most can benefit by programs and treatment, and we do that. We call them recommended programs, but really they're mandated if a person wants to, and these are sentence people, if a person wants to get those good time credits. So what is the recommendation to expand to, and why couldn't programs within a prison be connected? So if you are going to expand this to so many days per whatever, why can't that be linked to their involvement in programs within, or treatment within the state? Thank you.
Sure. The short answer is they are now. We have earned time, except for Measure 11 where the prisons are mandatory minimum. After that, they can get earned time. And for everything else, which is a lot of people, they get earned time up to 20%. 10% is earned off if they sign up for a program, even if they can't get in. and 10% is earned if they behave and don't get in trouble. So the proposal is to expand it to 30%. And I have a very strong reaction to this. And it's because of the history. You'll see there's a chart in your packet that shows you how sentences would change if you increased earned time to 30% and you increase transitional leave to 90 days from 30 days. Transitional leave is at the end for somebody leaving, just like it sounds. But it's the biggest myth of all, because they are legally still in prison. We can live with 30 days, 90 days, 3 months, technically in prison and not at the end. And if you add them together, people start serving 50% or more, a little bit more than 50% of their sentence. We had this before, and it was a disaster for victims, for everybody. My preference is if the legislature wants to shorten sentences beyond the 20% and the 30 days, shorten the sentence. So there's truth in sentencing. Person's basically going to do their sentence with a little bit of flexibility. Prisons are different than local jails. Crimes are less serious. People are in for much shorter. Jails have a lot more flexibility. I think we have to maintain truth in sentencing in the state system.
Patrick Wheeler, farm member. It's more
Real quick, we're gonna have to go off the television. We can still answer the question, but the Washington County Public Affairs Forum meets from 11:45. We have an hour program beginning at noon, actually 58 minutes, in which we share our concerns with the general cable television folks and streaming videos. So again, we're gonna go off camera, but the questions can continue. And Pat Wheeler, our forum member, is gonna ask this next question if our guests are willing to stick around and help us out. But thank you for viewing our program.
Patrick Wheeler, farm member. It's more an understanding. But you said that 3 other commissions got put on the shelf, or 2 others. What's going to keep this one in corollary? How do you guys come to consensus if you are all over the political line?
Great question. I would have done this differently. I would have gotten a few people in a room who actually know how things work. Larry and I were just talking that if they put us in a room, we could figure something out.
Although I did say that it wouldn't be nearly as good as if John did it himself.
or Larry. Yeah, it wasn't very nice. There are 2 problems here. One is, do we want to change sentencing from ideology? We just want shorter sentencing. Larry's clearly an advocate for that. There may be people in the audience who feel that way. Most Oregonians do not. That's just a fact. When they actually know the sentences, they don't. And I don't think they do now. Go look at the low-risk group and see for yourself. The other is it a money issue? So if it's a money issue, I think everyone's at the table. Because money's money, and we only have so much of it. So I think it's more difficult when it's ideological and less difficult when it's money, and the governor will decide which it is. The last 2 were very much more ideological, especially the first one, the reset committee. There was a DA on that, he quit, because he just couldn't sign it at the end. So this one, a lot more thought's been putting into how to do it, but we're still kind of in that place. Time will tell. We'll enforce the law, whatever the legislature passes, best we can. We're kind of in the stage where they're asking us what we think. But when it's all done, they'll write the laws.
Let me just say that about the ideological component of this. I think the real focus is on, as I said before, this being social science, making things better, not longer sentences, shorter sentences, this sort of thing, but let's just make it better. And I think there's really room for that in some sort of reform. As I indicated, my idea for cutting Measure 11 sentences, that's my personal view, but it's not what this commission is about. This commission is about using social science to implement changes that will make Oregon safer and also save money. That's the goal.
I think that's it. Then we'd like to thank John and Larry for showing up. forum members, we're going to be coming to you to ask your opinion on various things. Basically, Marie Tyler, the jail commander, is here because the sheriff's office buys a membership in which, a corporate type of membership, which 3 people are deemed to be members for purposes of discussion. So we have a lot of different ways you can be a member: individual, couples, corporate. And so a lot of things we're going to be talking about. And look at your emails, because we'll be contacting you directly. We've got one more meeting, which is the Christmas program next week. And then in January, we want the growth program to be well attended. It's one of the things that we're going to be doing with the mayors and other folks. And the West Side bypass has come up. A lot of the growth things are coming up again. If we can't be a success as a forum in January during our programs during that period of time, then we might have to think about the times that we meet and what we do. Maybe we're just a political agency during primary and general election where our attendance is great. So be aware of that. I see a lot of people who are thinking about and care about the forum, and the board's going to be talking about those things. We have a meeting the 1st January of the month, the first Monday that we are open, which I think is the 7th. After that, the board's going to be talking about all these issues, attendance issues and things like that. So strap them on. We'll be seeking input. Thank you.
Thank you.